The blue lights appeared in the rearview mirror of the silver Lexus at 2:17 p.m. on a Sunday in October, flashing against the autumn sunlight on Highway 52 just outside Charleston, South Carolina. Raymond Mitchell was driving exactly 47 miles per hour in a 55-mile-per-hour zone, his wife Dorothy beside him in the passenger seat, and they were returning from church where they had attended service and stayed for the potluck lunch that followed. Raymond was 71 years old, black, retired from the FBI after 32 years as a special agent, and he knew immediately upon seeing the patrol car lights that this stop was pretextual, that the stated reason would be something minor or fabricated, and that the actual reason was that a white police officer had seen an elderly black couple in a nice car and had decided to investigate whether the vehicle was stolen or whether there were other reasons to justify the stop. Dorothy, 69 years old and retired from a career as a high school English teacher, reached over and placed her hand on Raymond's arm, a gesture of solidarity and also of caution, both of them having learned through decades of navigating America as black people that traffic stops could escalate quickly and dangerously regardless of innocence or credentials. Raymond pulled onto the shoulder smoothly, put the car in park, turned off the engine, and placed both hands on the steering wheel, where they would be visible to the approaching officer, the choreography of compliance that black drivers performed to minimize risk. The officer who approached was young, white, probably in his late 20s, and his hand rested on his service weapon as he walked up to the driver's side window. His nameplate read, Officer B. Hartley, and his expression carried the particular combination of suspicion and authority that characterized many police interactions with black civilians. Raymond lowered the window and waited for the officer to speak, maintaining the calm demeanor he had cultivated over 3 decades of federal law enforcement work. "License and registration," Officer Hartley said without preamble, without explaining why he had initiated the stop, his tone conveying that explanation was not required, that his authority was sufficient justification. "May I ask why you pulled me over, officer?" Raymond kept his voice neutral, polite, the tone that signaled cooperation without subservience. "You were driving too slow, impeding traffic. License and registration." Raymond glanced at the speedometer, which showed he had been driving 47 in a 55, well within the normal range of speeds, and certainly not slow enough to impede traffic on the nearly empty highway. The explanation was pretextual, was not the actual reason for the stop, but challenging it directly would likely escalate the situation. Raymond reached slowly for his wallet, announcing his movements so the officer would not interpret them as threatening. "I'm reaching for my wallet now. It's in my inside jacket pocket." He retrieved his wallet, extracted his driver's license, and handed it to Officer Hartley along with the vehicle registration that Dorothy had retrieved from the glove compartment. Officer Hartley examined the documents, and Raymond saw the moment when the officer registered the address in an affluent neighborhood, when he looked at Raymond and Dorothy again with slightly revised assumptions, though the suspicion remained. "This your vehicle, Mr. Mitchell?" "Yes, officer. Purchased it 3 years ago." "You coming from somewhere?" "Church. Mount Zion Baptist. We attend service there every Sunday." Officer Hartley nodded, but his expression suggested he was still looking for a reason to extend the stop, to search the vehicle, to find something that would justify the initial decision to pull them over. Raymond had witnessed this dynamic countless times during his FBI career, had seen local police officers engaged in racial profiling and pretextual stops, had been trained in constitutional standards for reasonable suspicion and probable cause that this stop clearly violated. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, Mr. Mitchell." It was the moment when traffic stops became dangerous, when the veneer of routine enforcement gave way to the exercise of authority for its own sake, when officers escalated situations that did not require escalation because they could, because the power differential was so extreme, because black civilians had learned that resistance often resulted in violence. Dorothy's hand tightened on Raymond's arm, and he patted her hand gently before opening the door and stepping out of the vehicle. Raymond was 6 feet tall, had maintained his physical fitness through retirement, and carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and competence. Officer Hartley seemed to register this, seemed uncertain about how to proceed now that Raymond was standing in front of him, clearly not intoxicated or impaired or presenting any obvious justification for having been ordered out of the vehicle. "Is there a specific concern, officer?" Raymond asked, still maintaining the neutral tone, still giving the officer opportunities to de-escalate, still hoping this could be resolved without requiring him to reveal his background. "Just want to make sure everything's in order. You been drinking today?" "No, sir, we were at church, as I mentioned. We don't drink alcohol." "You mind if I search your vehicle?" And there it was. The request that was technically voluntary, but that was delivered in a way that suggested refusal would be interpreted as suspicious, would provide justification for detention, would likely result in the search happening anyway under some invented probable cause. Raymond had been in law enforcement long enough to know his rights, to know that he could refuse consent, but he also knew that refusal often led to escalation, that asserting rights was frequently treated as evidence of guilt. Raymond made a decision. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, the same one where his wallet had been, and he withdrew the leather credential case that he still carried, even though he had retired 5 years ago. He opened it to display his FBI badge and identification card, held it up so Officer Hartley could see it clearly, and watched the young officer's face change color, the blood draining away as he realized he had pulled over and was attempting to search the vehicle of a retired FBI special agent. "I'm Raymond Mitchell, retired FBI. I spent 32 years with the Bureau, including 15 years in this region. I was driving 47 in a 55, which is not impeding traffic, and does not constitute reasonable suspicion for a stop. I'm going to ask you to explain the actual reason you pulled me over, and I'm going to document this encounter for potential filing with your department's Internal Affairs Division and with the FBI's Civil Rights Office." Officer Hartley stared at the credentials, his expression cycling through recognition and fear and defensive anger. "I pulled you over for a legitimate traffic reason. You were driving erratically. I was driving steadily at 47 miles per hour on a straight highway with minimal traffic. There was no erratic driving. What I believe happened is that you saw a black couple in a nice car, and you made assumptions that led you to initiate a pretextual stop. That's racial profiling, Officer Hartley, and it's a violation of constitutional rights and potentially a federal civil rights violation." Stories like this one, accounts of how law enforcement officers target black civilians through pretextual stops and racial profiling, even when those civilians have professional credentials and institutional authority, deserve wide circulation. If you're reading this and recognizing patterns that extend beyond individual incidents to systemic practices, consider the importance of sharing these narratives with others who need to understand how pervasive these dynamics remain. Officer Hartley's hand moved away from his service weapon, his posture shifting from aggressive to defensive. "I was doing my job. If you want to file a complaint, that's your right. But I followed proper procedures. Proper procedures require reasonable suspicion for a stop. Driving slightly below the speed limit is not reasonable suspicion. And ordering me out of the vehicle and requesting to search without probable cause extends an invalid stop into potential false detention." "I know the law, Officer Hartley. I taught constitutional policing at the FBI Academy, so I'm going to give you an opportunity to end this encounter now, to return my license and registration, and to reconsider your approach to traffic enforcement." Officer Hartley returned the documents without further comment, walked back to his patrol car, and drove away without issuing a citation or providing any additional justification for the stop. Raymond stood beside the Lexus for a moment, breathing deeply, managing the adrenaline that came from confrontations with police, even when you had the authority and knowledge to challenge them, even when you knew you were in the right. Dorothy had been recording the interaction on her phone, holding it discreetly but capturing audio and video of the conversation, documentation that would be valuable if Raymond decided to pursue the complaint he had mentioned. She stopped recording as Raymond got back into the car, and she looked at him with an expression that combined relief and anger and exhaustion. 32 years with the FBI, and you still get pulled over for driving while black, Dorothy said, her voice tight with the emotion she had been suppressing during the encounter. "He was going to search our car, Raymond. He was going to treat us like criminals because we're black, and we have a nice car, and he couldn't imagine any legitimate reason for that combination." Raymond started the car and pulled back onto the highway, his hands steady on the wheel, but his mind processing what had happened and what it revealed about how little had changed, despite his career in federal law enforcement, despite the training and policies and stated commitments to constitutional policing. He had been pulled over before many times over his 7 decades of life, and each incident had carried the same dynamics: the initial suspicion, the pretextual justification, The search for reasons to extend the stop, the underlying assumption that black people in certain contexts did not belong and needed to be investigated. But this incident felt different, because Raymond was retired, because he had thought that perhaps the most egregious encounters would end when he was no longer actively working, because he and Dorothy had been simply driving home from church and had been targeted anyway. The incident crystallized something that Raymond had always known intellectually, but that felt newly visceral, which was that institutional authority and professional credentials provided only limited protection against racism, that the assumptions embedded in American policing operated largely independent of individual circumstances or achievements. They drove in silence for several miles, both processing the encounter, both thinking about what to do next. Raymond had meant what he said about filing complaints, had the knowledge and the resources and the connections to pursue accountability, but he also knew from experience that complaints about police misconduct rarely resulted in meaningful consequences, that officers were protected by union contracts and qualified immunity and internal affairs processes designed to shield them from discipline. "Are you going to file the complaint?" Dorothy asked finally, breaking the silence. "I'm thinking about it. The question is what outcome I'm seeking. Do I want this specific officer disciplined? Do I want to use this incident to highlight broader patterns? Do I want to work within the system or go public?" "You know what I think," Dorothy said, and Raymond did know, because they had had variations of this conversation throughout their marriage, throughout the decades when Raymond had worked within law enforcement, while Dorothy had been more skeptical about whether institutions could be reformed from inside. "I think you should go public. I think you should use your platform and your credibility to make this visible, because most people who get pulled over like this don't have FBI credentials and don't have the knowledge to challenge it. You have both. You have a responsibility to use them." Raymond nodded slowly, knowing she was right, knowing that his silence would be a form of complicity, knowing that his career had given him unusual leverage that should be deployed toward accountability and change. But he also felt the weight of what going public would mean, the attention it would generate, the criticism it would invite from police unions and from people who viewed any critique of law enforcement as betrayal, the emotional labor of repeatedly explaining and justifying and educating people who were determined not to understand. They arrived home to their house in a quiet neighborhood of Charleston, a comfortable 3-bedroom home they had bought 15 years earlier when Raymond was still with the Bureau, and they sat in the living room discussing how to proceed. Dorothy wanted Raymond to contact the media immediately, to give interviews while the incident was fresh, to use the video she had recorded as evidence. Raymond wanted to be more methodical, to file formal complaints first, to document everything carefully, to give the system opportunity to respond before escalating to public exposure. They compromised, deciding that Raymond would file complaints with both the local police department and with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, that Dorothy would edit the video to highlight the key moments, and that they would wait to see how the official channels responded before deciding whether to go public. It was a strategic approach, gave them flexibility while preserving options, and allowed Raymond to feel that he was following proper procedures, even as Dorothy remained skeptical that proper procedures would produce meaningful results. Raymond filed the complaints the following day, submitting detailed written accounts to the Charleston County Sheriff's Office Internal Affairs Division and to the FBI Field Office in Columbia. He included Dorothy's video, described Officer Hartley's lack of reasonable suspicion for the stop, explained how the request to search the vehicle had been coercive rather than genuinely voluntary, and articulated how the encounter constituted racial profiling and potential civil rights violations. The responses to the complaints revealed exactly the dynamics Raymond had anticipated. The sheriff's office acknowledged receipt and stated that Internal Affairs would investigate, but provided no timeline and no indication of what the investigation would entail. The FBI's Civil Rights Division similarly acknowledged the complaint, but noted that investigation would depend on prioritization and available resources, that pattern and practice investigations took precedence over individual incidents, and that Raymond should not expect rapid resolution. The institutional responses were frustrating but not surprising, and after 2 weeks of waiting with no substantive updates, Raymond and Dorothy decided to go public. Dorothy had connections with a local journalist who had covered civil rights issues, a black woman named Keisha Thompson, who worked for the Charleston Post and Courier, and Raymond agreed to give her an interview about the traffic stop and about broader patterns of racial profiling in the region. The interview took place at Raymond and Dorothy's home, and Keisha asked thoughtful questions that went beyond just the incident itself to explore Raymond's career with the FBI, his perspective on how law enforcement treated black civilians, his thoughts on what reforms were needed, and what message he wanted to convey to both police officers and to community members who experienced similar treatment. Raymond was candid in ways that he had not been able to be during his active career, when speaking publicly about law enforcement problems could have been interpreted as disloyalty or as undermining the Bureau's mission. He described the traffic stop in detail, explained why Officer Hartley's stated justification was pretextual, and connected the incident to broader patterns of racial profiling that he had observed throughout his career, both as a victim and as a federal agent investigating civil rights violations. The problem is not just individual officers making bad decisions, Raymond told Keisha. The problem is systemic. Racial profiling is embedded in how police are trained, in what behaviors are incentivized, in how suspicion gets constructed. Officers are taught to look for indicators that someone might be engaged in criminal activity, but those indicators are often just proxies for race and class. A black person in an expensive car becomes suspicious not because of any actual evidence of wrongdoing, but because of assumptions about who should have access to wealth. And having FBI credentials didn't protect you from being profiled, Keisha noted. It provided me protection once I revealed them. Once Officer Hartley understood that pulling me over could have professional consequences for him. But the initial decision to pull me over was based purely on what he saw, a black couple in a nice car. My credentials were invisible until I chose to reveal them. Most black people don't have those credentials. They experience the same profiling, but without any institutional leverage to challenge it. That's what makes this systemic, rather than individual. The article ran 4 days later with the headline, "Retired FBI Agent Details Traffic Stop, Alleges Racial Profiling by Local Deputy." It included excerpts from the interview, embedded Dorothy's video of the encounter, and provided context about racial profiling statistics in Charleston County and across South Carolina. The article noted that the sheriff's office had declined to comment on the pending investigation, but had issued a statement defending their officers' professionalism and their commitment to constitutional policing. The article generated immediate attention, was shared widely on social media, was picked up by other news outlets, including some national publications. Raymond's status as a retired FBI agent gave the story credibility and newsworthiness that similar stories without that element often lacked, and the video evidence made the profiling undeniable in ways that were difficult to dismiss or explain away. The response was intense and divided. Many people, particularly in black communities and among civil rights advocates, praised Raymond for speaking out, shared their own stories of being profiled, and called for accountability for Officer Hartley and for broader reforms to address racial profiling. Some law enforcement officials acknowledged that the stop appeared problematic, that reasonable suspicion seemed lacking, and that this incident highlighted the need for better training and oversight. But there was also significant backlash, particularly from police unions and from conservative commentators who framed Raymond's complaint as anti-police, who suggested he was playing the race card, who argued that officers needed to be able to use their judgment and discretion without being second-guessed. Some of the criticism was explicitly racist, questioning whether Raymond had really been an FBI agent, or suggesting he had somehow provoked the stop or edited the video to make it look worse than it was. The sheriff's office was forced to respond more substantively given the media attention, and the sheriff himself, a white man named Robert Crawford, who had been in office for 12 years, held a press conference addressing the incident. Sheriff Crawford stated that he took allegations of racial profiling seriously, that Internal Affairs was conducting a thorough investigation, and that if wrongdoing was found, appropriate disciplinary action would be taken. But he also defended his deputies generally, emphasized the dangers of police work, and suggested that the public should not rush to judgment based on a brief video clip. Raymond watched the press conference and felt the familiar frustration of seeing institutional defensiveness prioritized over accountability, of watching a sheriff defend his department rather than acknowledge obvious problems, of recognizing that even clear evidence of misconduct would be minimized and explained away if possible. He had spent 32 years working within law enforcement systems, had seen how these dynamics operated from the inside, and he knew that meaningful change would require more than just his individual complaint. He began connecting with civil rights organizations in South Carolina, sharing his story and his expertise, offering to support broader campaigns around traffic stop reform and racial profiling. The ACLU of South Carolina had been working on these issues for years, had documented patterns of discriminatory enforcement, had advocated for policy changes including restrictions on pretextual stops and requirements for data collection on stops and searches. Raymond met with the ACLU's legal director, a black man named James Foster, who had litigated civil rights cases throughout the South, and they discussed how Raymond's case might be used strategically to advance reform efforts. James was interested in potentially filing a federal civil rights lawsuit, not primarily for monetary damages, but to compel systemic changes through court oversight to force the sheriff's office to implement policies and training that would address racial profiling. The challenge with these cases is proving pattern and practice, James explained. Your incident is egregious and well documented, but courts are often reluctant to impose systemic remedies based on individual incidents. What we need is to demonstrate that your experience is not isolated, that there's a broader pattern of discriminatory enforcement. Do you think you could help us document that pattern, talk to other community members who've been profiled, use your law enforcement background to analyze the data? Raymond agreed, and over the following months he became deeply involved in the campaign to address racial profiling in Charleston County. He conducted interviews with dozens of black residents who had been stopped by sheriff's deputies, documented their experiences, identified patterns in the stated justifications for stops and in the demographics of who was being stopped. He reviewed traffic stop data that the sheriff's office was required to collect under state law, analyzed the data for racial disparities, and found that black drivers were stopped at rates disproportionate to their share of the driving population and were searched at much higher rates than white drivers, despite being less likely to have contraband found. The data was damning, revealed exactly the patterns that Raymond's own experience had illustrated, showed that racial profiling was not exceptional but routine, not the result of a few bad officers, but embedded in the department's enforcement practices. Raymond compiled the findings into a comprehensive report, combining quantitative data with qualitative accounts from community members, and the ACLU released the report publicly with Raymond as the primary author. The report generated another wave of media attention, shifted the narrative from one incident to systemic problems, and created pressure for the sheriff's office to respond more substantively than just investigating Officer Hartley. Community groups organized, held rallies demanding reform, called for the sheriff to implement changes to traffic stop policies and to increase transparency and accountability. Sheriff Crawford responded by announcing a review of traffic stop practices, by committing to enhanced training on implicit bias and constitutional policing, and by creating a community advisory board that would provide input on law enforcement practices. The announcements were significant symbolically, but remained vague on specifics, did not commit to concrete policy changes, and appeared designed more to reduce public pressure than to address underlying problems. Raymond and the ACLU pushed for more, presenting specific policy proposals, including restrictions on pretextual stops, requirements that officers articulate reasonable suspicion clearly before extending stops, mandatory recording of all traffic stops, and regular public reporting of stop data disaggregated by race. The sheriff's office resisted most of these proposals, arguing they would hamper officers' ability to do their jobs, that the proposed restrictions were overly rigid, that existing policies were adequate if properly followed. If these patterns, these institutional dynamics, where clear evidence of racial profiling leads to minimal reform, and where law enforcement agencies resist accountability even when problems are thoroughly documented, resonate with your understanding of how change does or doesn't happen in your community, consider the importance of ensuring that accounts like Raymond's reach audiences who can build pressure for substantive change. Individual stories matter, but systemic change requires collective action. The negotiations over policy reforms stretched across a year, involved countless meetings and public hearings and media appearances, required Raymond to use all his knowledge of law enforcement systems and his credibility as a retired FBI agent, and his willingness to be public about an experience that remained painful. Dorothy supported him throughout, attended meetings when possible, continued documenting incidents through her own networks, and remained the person who reminded Raymond to take care of himself while engaging in this exhausting work. Eventually, after sustained pressure and with the threat of federal litigation from the ACLU, Sheriff Crawford agreed to implement a modified version of the proposed reforms. The agreement included restrictions on extending traffic stops without articulable reasonable suspicion, requirements that deputies document the reason for stops in detail, mandatory body camera recording of all traffic encounters, and quarterly public reporting of stop data with demographic breakdowns. The agreement was not everything Raymond and the ACLU had sought, was weaker than optimal, and contained loopholes and relied heavily on implementation and enforcement, but it represented real progress, created more transparency and accountability than had existed before, and established principles that could be strengthened over time through continued advocacy. Raymond felt cautiously satisfied with the outcome, understood it as incremental progress rather than comprehensive solution, recognized that the work would need to continue to ensure the policies were actually implemented and to address remaining gaps. But he also felt exhausted, felt the weight of the year of advocacy, and began thinking about what role he wanted to play going forward. He was 73 now, had spent a year doing intense public advocacy work on top of 32 years in federal law enforcement, and he was ready to step back from leading campaigns even as he remained committed to supporting the work. He and Dorothy discussed how to transition, how to hand off leadership to younger organizers while remaining available as resources, how to use his remaining time and energy for what mattered most. They decided that Raymond would continue working with the ACLU in an advisory capacity, would provide expertise and testimony when needed, but would not be primary spokesperson or lead organizer. He would also work on a memoir, documenting his career with the FBI and his experiences with racism, both as a black man in America and as a black agent in a predominantly white institution, using his story to illuminate broader patterns and to contribute to public understanding of how law enforcement really operated. The memoir project gave Raymond structure and purpose, while being less demanding than active organizing, allowed him to process and reflect on his experiences, and provided a vehicle for sharing knowledge and perspectives that might otherwise be lost. He worked on it steadily over 2 years, writing in the mornings, revising in the afternoons, talking through difficult memories with Dorothy in the evenings. The book, titled Under Investigation, A Black FBI Agent's Life in Law Enforcement, was published when Raymond was 75, and it received significant attention both for Raymond's perspective as an insider and for his willingness to critique the institution he had spent his career serving. The book covered his decision to join the FBI in the late 1970s, his experiences as one of relatively few black agents, the cases he worked including civil rights investigations, the institutional racism he observed and experienced, and the traffic stop incident that had catalyzed his post-retirement advocacy. Reviews were generally positive, particularly from civil rights advocates, and from readers who appreciated Raymond's nuanced analysis of law enforcement institutions, his refusal to either demonize or romanticize policing, his insistence that accountability and reform were compatible with public safety. Some law enforcement officials criticized the book as betraying the profession or as providing ammunition to anti-police activists, but others acknowledged that Raymond's critiques were fair and that the issues he identified were real and needed to be addressed. The book became a resource for advocates working on police reform, was assigned in criminal justice courses at several universities, and provided Raymond a platform for continued public education through interviews and speaking engagements. He was selective about which invitations he accepted, prioritizing venues where his perspective might genuinely contribute to change rather than just generating attention, and he always brought Dorothy with him when he traveled, both because he valued her partnership and because she had her own insights to share from decades of observing policing from a civilian perspective. They gave a joint presentation at a national conference on racial justice, describing the traffic stop and the subsequent advocacy campaign and the policy changes they had helped achieve, and they emphasized lessons they had learned about how change happened and what factors made reform more or less likely to succeed. The presentation was honest about difficulties and frustrations, acknowledged that progress had been limited and hard-won, but also articulated hope that incremental changes could accumulate into something more significant over time. During the Q&A session, a young black woman asked whether Raymond regretted his career in law enforcement, whether he felt complicit in systems that harmed black communities, whether he would make the same choices if he could start over. The question was challenging but respectful, reflected real tensions about how to evaluate individuals who worked within oppressive institutions, and Raymond appreciated the directness. "I don't regret my career," Raymond said after thinking for a moment, "but I understand why the question is important and why my answer might not satisfy everyone. I believed when I joined the FBI that I could make a difference from inside the system, that having black agents would improve how law enforcement related to black communities, that I could work civil rights cases and investigate discriminatory policing. And I did work those cases, did investigate civil rights violations, did try to make the Bureau better. But I also know now, more clearly than I knew then, that individual good intentions are insufficient to transform institutions, that my presence as a black agent did not fundamentally change how the FBI operated or how local police treated black civilians. The system is bigger than any individual, absorbs and neutralizes dissent, protects itself through procedures and cultures that resist change. So I don't regret my career, but I also don't believe my career solved the problems it was meant to address. What I learned is that changing institutions requires not just working inside them, but also challenging them from outside, using whatever leverage you have to force accountability and reform." The answer seemed to satisfy the questioner, seemed to acknowledge complexity without being defensive, and it reflected Raymond's own ongoing processing of his career and its meaning and limitations. He had been proud to be an FBI agent, had believed in the work he was doing, had tried to be the kind of agent who treated people fairly and who investigated real crimes rather than targeting communities. But he also understood that his individual conduct existed within systems that were unjust, that his career had been made possible partly by his willingness to accommodate those systems, and that the post-retirement advocacy he was doing now was in some ways an effort to address what his career had not accomplished. At 76, Raymond's health began declining, not dramatically but noticeably, the accumulated effects of age and stress and decades of work taking their toll. He had a minor heart incident that required hospitalization and lifestyle changes, was diagnosed with early-stage kidney disease that required monitoring and medication, and found that his energy was reduced in ways that made sustained advocacy work difficult. He and Dorothy adjusted their lives, reduced commitments, focused on family and rest and enjoying the time they had. Raymond continued working with the ACLU on an occasional basis, provided testimony when needed, but stepped back from most public activities. The memoir continued selling steadily, continued being used as a resource, and Raymond received messages regularly from readers who found it valuable or illuminating or validating. He thought often about the traffic stop, about the incident that had catalyzed so much of his post-retirement work, about Officer Hartley's face when Raymond had shown his FBI credentials. The memory remained vivid, remained the crystallizing moment when abstract knowledge about racial profiling had become personal experience in a way that demanded response. Raymond had responded, had used his credentials and expertise toward accountability and reform, had contributed to changing policies in Charleston County and to educating broader audiences about how profiling operated. But Raymond also thought about all the traffic stops that happened without his credentials being present, without FBI agents being pulled over, without clear video documentation, without the media attention or advocacy campaigns or policy reforms. He thought about the thousands of black drivers stopped every day across America on pretextual grounds, treated with suspicion and disrespect, searched and detained, and sometimes arrested or assaulted or killed, their complaints dismissed or ignored or used against them. His own incident had been resolved with relative justice, had led to meaningful changes, at least locally, but the broader system remained largely unchanged, continued producing similar incidents, continued treating black civilians as inherently suspicious and dangerous. The work Raymond had done mattered, had helped some people, and had created some accountability. But it was a drop in an ocean of injustice that required much more than individual advocacy to transform. At 78, Raymond was asked to speak at a law enforcement symposium on community relations, an invitation that he initially declined because he was tired and his health was fragile, and he was not sure he had anything new to say. But Dorothy encouraged him to accept, arguing that his perspective was still valuable and still rare, that opportunities to speak directly to law enforcement about racial profiling were important to seize, and that he might reach some officers who could actually implement change in their own practices. Raymond agreed, and he prepared his remarks carefully, wanting to be honest without being alienating, wanting to challenge without being dismissive, wanting to articulate what officers needed to understand about how their actions impacted black communities. The speech described the traffic stop, analyzed what Officer Hartley had done wrong, and explained why the incident represented broader patterns rather than isolated misconduct. When Officer Hartley pulled me over for driving too slow, he was engaging in pretextual enforcement, Raymond told the audience of officers and administrators and community leaders. The stated reason was not the actual reason. The actual reason was that he saw a black couple in a nice car and he made assumptions that led him to investigate. That's racial profiling. And it happens constantly, shapes countless interactions between police and black civilians, creates fear and mistrust and anger that undermine both public safety and police legitimacy. The solution is not just training officers to be less biased, though that's important. The solution is changing the structures that make profiling possible and incentivized. It's restricting pretextual stops, requiring clear articulation of reasonable suspicion, creating accountability when officers abuse their authority. It's recognizing that police cannot build community trust while simultaneously treating whole communities as suspects. You have to choose. You can have aggressive enforcement that treats everyone as potential criminals, or you can have community trust and cooperation. You cannot have both. The speech was direct, pulled no punches, and the response was mixed. Some officers and administrators thanked Raymond afterward, told him they recognized the problems he described and wanted to be part of solutions. Others were defensive, argued that he was making policing impossible, suggested that concern about profiling would prevent officers from being proactive. And some were simply silent, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, processing what they had heard with expressions Raymond could not read. But the speech was recorded and circulated, became a resource that advocacy groups used in their own training and education efforts, and Raymond received messages from officers who told him the speech had changed their thinking, or their approach, or their willingness to question departmental practices. The impact was impossible to measure precisely, could not be quantified or proven, but Raymond believed it was real, believed that words and stories and direct appeals to conscience sometimes changed minds in ways that policies and lawsuits could not. At 79, Raymond and Dorothy celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by family and friends and colleagues from various chapters of their lives. The celebration included stories about their decades together, about the challenges they had navigated as a black couple in America, about Dorothy's teaching career and Raymond's law enforcement work, and the advocacy they had done together in retirement. One of their granddaughters, Jasmine, 23 years old and attending law school, gave a toast that acknowledged how much Raymond and Dorothy had sacrificed and contributed, how their lives had been shaped by fighting racism in various forms, how their example had influenced younger generations to continue that fight. The toast was moving and genuine, and Raymond felt both proud and melancholy, proud of what he and Dorothy had accomplished, and melancholy about how much work remained, how many of the same battles were still being fought by Jasmine's generation. After the celebration, Raymond and Jasmine talked privately about her plans, about her interest in civil rights law, about whether she was prepared for the challenges and frustrations and emotional toll of that work. Raymond was honest about difficulties, about the ways the system resisted change, about how exhausting it was to keep fighting when progress was slow and victories were partial. But it's still worth doing, Raymond told her, not because success is guaranteed or because the work is easy, but because the alternative is accepting injustice, letting people continue being harmed without resistance. You'll lose more cases than you win. You'll get exhausted and discouraged and angry. But you'll also help people, create some accountability, contribute to slow accumulation of changes that might eventually add up to transformation. That has to be enough, because waiting for perfect conditions or guaranteed outcomes means never acting at all. Jasmine nodded, absorbing the wisdom of someone who had lived these truths, and Raymond felt satisfied that at least some of what he had learned would be passed on, would inform how the next generation approached the work, would perhaps help them be more strategic, or more resilient, or more effective than his generation had been. At 80, Raymond's kidney disease progressed to the point where he needed dialysis, a treatment that consumed hours multiple times per week and that left him exhausted and limited in what he could do. He stepped back from most activities beyond family time, spent his energy on what mattered most, made peace with the reality that his active working life, including the advocacy work of retirement, was ending. He continued receiving messages from people who had read his book or seen his speeches or been influenced by the policy changes he had helped achieve in Charleston County, people thanking him for his work or asking for advice or sharing their own stories. Raymond responded when he could, offered encouragement and perspective, tried to be useful even as his capacity diminished. Dorothy remained his constant companion, managed his medical care, advocated for him with healthcare providers, maintained their social connections, and their home and the daily routines that gave structure to life lived increasingly slowly. They had been partners for 5 decades, had navigated so much together, and Dorothy's presence was the foundation that allowed Raymond to face declining health with some equanimity. At 81, Raymond had a series of health crises, complications from the kidney disease and from heart problems, and from other conditions that accumulate with age. He was hospitalized multiple times, underwent various treatments, experienced periods of improved health followed by setbacks. Through it all, he maintained the same dignity and grace that had characterized his approach to life, remained engaged with family and friends, remained interested in the world and in the work that others were continuing. The traffic stop remained present in his memory, remained the moment that had defined his final decade of active work, remained the crystallizing incident that had made abstract problems concrete and personal. Raymond did not regret how he had responded, did not regret speaking out or the years of advocacy that followed, felt that he had used what happened at Highway 52 towards something meaningful, even if insufficient. He thought about Officer Hartley sometimes, wondered what had become of the young deputy, whether the investigation and the media attention and the policy changes had affected his career or his approach. Raymond had never heard from Hartley directly, had never received an apology or any acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and he did not expect to. The system had imposed some accountability through policy changes and public exposure, but individual responsibility had been absorbed into institutional processes, and Hartley had likely moved on without significant consequences. That was how the system worked. Protected individuals while maybe changing some policies, distributed accountability so diffusely that no one person faced full responsibility for injustice that was systemic. Raymond understood this, had seen it operate throughout his career and his advocacy work, but understanding did not eliminate the frustration or the sense that justice remained incomplete. At 82, Raymond Mitchell died at home with Dorothy beside him, and family gathered, having lived a full life that had included 3 decades in federal law enforcement and a final decade of advocacy catalyzed by being pulled over for driving too slow on a highway in South Carolina. His death was noted in obituaries that described his FBI career, his work on civil rights cases, his post-retirement advocacy around racial profiling, and the policy changes he had helped achieve in Charleston County. Dorothy survived him, continued living in their home, maintained connections with the advocacy organizations Raymond had worked with, and served as keeper of his legacy, ensuring that the lessons from his life and work remained available to others who were continuing the struggle for police accountability and racial justice. The traffic stop video remained available online, continued being shared and viewed, continued serving as evidence of how racial profiling operated and why reform was necessary. The policies that Raymond had helped establish in Charleston County remained in effect, provided more transparency and accountability than had existed before, and served as models for advocates in other jurisdictions who were working on similar reforms. And the questions Raymond had raised about racial profiling and pretextual stops, and how law enforcement treated black civilians, remained urgent, remained unresolved at systemic level, even as some local improvements had been achieved. The work Raymond had contributed to continued through others, through the advocates he had mentored and inspired, through the organizations he had supported, through the example he had set of using institutional authority and expertise toward justice. If you have followed Raymond Mitchell's story from that Sunday afternoon traffic stop to decades of service and advocacy, from being profiled by a young deputy to using his FBI credentials to demand accountability, and if you understand that his experience illuminates patterns that extend across American policing and that require sustained attention and collective action to address, then the challenge is to consider what responsibilities that understanding creates for you. Consider sharing this account with others who need to see these patterns documented and analyzed. Consider supporting the organizations working on police accountability and racial justice in your community. Consider using whatever expertise or resources or platforms you possess toward similar ends, toward the transformation of systems that continue producing the same injustices that Raymond experienced and spent his final years fighting to address. The story that began with blue lights on Highway 52 had expanded across years and jurisdictions and generations, had reached law enforcement officials and community organizers and policymakers, had contributed to changes that were real, if insufficient. It was one story among millions, was representative rather than unique, but it had been told effectively and used strategically, and that made it part of the larger project of social transformation. Raymond had played his part, had used what happened to him to illuminate broader problems, had leveraged his credentials and his knowledge toward accountability and reform, had refused to let the incident be simply a private indignity resolved quietly. The work continued through those he had influenced and through the structures he had helped change, and would require continued effort through coming generations. That was the legacy, the contribution, the meaning extracted from being pulled over for driving too slow when the actual offense was driving while black in a nice car. That was what Raymond Mitchell had built from that moment when Officer Hartley's face went pale upon seeing FBI credentials, that moment of recognition that the elderly black man he had profiled and was attempting to search was someone with institutional authority and the knowledge to challenge police misconduct. The moment had been catalytic but not conclusive, had opened opportunities for advocacy, but had not resolved the underlying problems, had produced policy changes that improved conditions locally without transforming systems nationally. That was the reality of how change happened or failed to happen, how individual incidents connected to collective struggles, how progress accumulated incrementally through sustained effort across years and decades and generations. The work continues as it always does, beyond individual stories and individual lifetimes. Raymond Mitchell's contribution was significant and valuable, but it was also limited and incomplete, requiring others to build on foundations that had been laid, to push further toward the justice that remained aspirational rather than actual. Our challenge extended to everyone encountering this story, to recognize it not as conclusion, but as continuing narrative, not as solution, but as illustration of both possibility and necessity. Traffic stops continue happening, racial profiling continues operating, black drivers continue being treated with suspicion and subjected to pretextual enforcement, officers continue making assumptions based on race that shape interactions in dangerous and unconstitutional ways. The patterns Raymond experienced and exposed and fought against remain largely intact, changed at margins but persistent at core. But resistance also continues. Advocacy persists. Communities organize and demand accountability. Policies slowly improve. Consciousness gradually shifts. The accumulated impact of these efforts, the collective resistance across millions of interactions and thousands of campaigns and hundreds of policy changes determines whether conditions improve or whether injustice persists unchanged. Raymond Mitchell contributed what he could with what he had, used his experience and his credentials toward justice and accountability, built something meaningful from being pulled over on a Sunday afternoon. Others will make their own contributions, in their own contexts, facing their own versions of the choice Raymond faced when Officer Hartley pulled him over, whether to accept mistreatment quietly or to challenge it publicly, whether to use privilege and platform toward individual protection or toward collective change, whether to accommodate injustice or to resist it. The answers to those questions, the accumulated choices made by people encountering injustice and deciding how to respond, shape whether the society we leave to future generations is more just or merely different, whether the patterns Raymond fought against are eliminated or simply adapted, whether stories like his become obsolete because the problems they describe no longer exist or remain relevant because those problems persist unchanged. That is the challenge, the responsibility, the work that continues beyond this story and beyond any individual life. Raymond Mitchell understood this, lived it in his final years, and left behind a legacy that remains available to anyone willing to learn from it and to act accordingly. The rest depends on choices yet to be made, on whether enough people in enough moments choose resistance over accommodation, justice over comfort, collective liberation over individual protection. The blue lights on Highway 52 had illuminated more than just one traffic stop, had revealed patterns and systems and possibilities that extended far beyond that particular moment. What remains is for others to see what those lights revealed, to understand what it means, and to act on that understanding in ways that honor Raymond's work while recognizing its incompleteness, that build on his contributions while pushing beyond their limitations, that transform his individual story into collective movement toward the justice he spent his life pursuing.